Well, it is very nice to be back in Erie after my trip. I just got back yesterday, so I'm still a little tired, and I was traveling to attend the Institute for the Learning Ministry, which is a gathering of Unitarian Universalist ministers to continue learning throughout our careers, and also to support one another in our ministries. It was supposed to be in sunny San Diego, and I was all excited about that trip, and then Omicron happened. So like many of you, I needed to make some changes, and I wasn't quite ready to fly, but I was able to drive to Sturgis, Michigan, and join 3 other colleagues, friends of mine, for some time in an Airbnb together, and that was a lot of fun too, as we shared the Institute learnings together as we participated online. So from San Diego to Sturgis, we make our changes, and we improvise, and we figure out new ways of being together. And I know that we're all doing that right now throughout this month of February, and I am so grateful for the flexibility of this community as we continue to live through these times that we're in. So that meant that I did not get to spend my first Groundhog Day as a Pennsylvanian in Pennsylvania. So I'll have that to look forward to on another Groundhog Day. And I've been thinking about the way that we cling to this little groundhog as the predictor of what's going to happen over the next few weeks. We want something, don't we? We want something to cling to, whether or not it makes sense, to tell us that winter will end. And so whether or not we believe in it, we kind of look to Dunkirk Dave or Punxsutawney Phil as a kind of sage who will tell us what to do and what to plan. And the truth is that there's often nothing to cling to in these times that we're in and in this life that we share. And so I want to talk today about something that we do use to in this Unitarian Universalist faith that we share as a way of helping us figure out how we want to be together and how we need to live according to what we believe in. And last week, we talked about covenant and what that means, a set of promises that we make to one another, knowing that we can't always live up to them. And also sometimes some plans for restoration of those promises when we can't live into them. And so today we'll be talking about the Unitarian Universalist principles. And I just want to say too that the UU principles and purposes were created as a part of the Unitarian Universalist Association's governance bylaws work. And so if you ever think that bylaw work isn't important, you can just look at the principles and say, wow, look at how that has taken off. Look at how that has become a touchstone of Unitarian Universalism in the last 70 years. And you know that what you are doing is important. Your words and your work and your writing is important. Now, I am going to share some of the story of how we got to where we are now, the Unitarian Universalist 7 principles, because it didn't always exist in that form. And so there are stories embedded in stories and embedded in stories about other statements of principle that led to the creation of this one. So not only are all the principles interdependent, they all work together, but all of these statements of belief and affirmation and principle through the years all work together as well. It's hard to separate one from the other. They all come out of each other. So the current version of what's called Article 2 in the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, in our bylaws, where these principles and purposes live, it was last revised, believe it or not, in 1995. So that was kind of a long time ago now, if you think about it. So we haven't really looked at them and said, are these really working for us? For quite some time. Now, if we were all here in the sanctuary, I would ask you to pull out a hymnal and read the 7 principles along with me. But unfortunately, we're not. And we could also, of course, just look around the room. But you have heard them several times in several different forms this morning. And if you happen to have a gray hymnal at home, you can follow along. They are in the front of the gray hymnal as well. So Article 2 begins with a statement of covenant. We talked about that last week. Then goes on to list these 7 principles that we covenant to affirm and promote. And then next comes the 6 sources of our tradition, which we'll probably talk about on another Sunday. And then finally, an affirmation of the congregations to support one another. Now, this central statement of our faith has not always looked like this. And so there are times when it has changed. We have voted to change it. During those times, some people get upset and they decide that they can't handle it or they don't believe in it and they leave the faith. And then other people are invited into the faith by the changes that we make. So you can imagine, maybe we can imagine this as a river that is always changing and flowing. Now, I want to thank my friend, Reverend Rebecca Gant, for putting together this timeline of the history of the principles. So when in 1961, the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church in America, 2 separate denominations, voted to merge, creating Unitarian Universalism. Each of them brought with them a statement of belief. The Universalists, they were a more established denomination at that time, and they brought with them a revised version of a statement of belief that was written in 1803, and it was called the Winchester Profession. And this statement affirmed that in God's love and forbearance, all souls will be saved. This statement put the Universalist belief in direct conflict with Calvinists' perspectives that were prevalent at that time, which said that some souls would be saved and that others would be damned according to God's will, regardless of what you did or didn't do on this earth. So according to Calvinism, there was just this order of things. It was going to come down. Nothing you did, no good works, no good deeds, living your life clean, none of that was going to help you in the end if you were not on that list. So the Winchester Confession included a liberty clause that stated that local congregations could adapt this in their own ways, their own statements of beliefs, provided that it did not conflict with the ideas in this central statement of principle. So the Unitarians, for their side, came to the merger with a statement of belief that was that was born more out of struggle and had more complexity to it. The Unitarians in the United States first existed not so much as a denomination, but as a movement of individuals within the congregations of the established churches of New England. So in 1825, the American Unitarian Association was formed to support Unitarian missionaries and to publish religious tracts. And in those first 100 years or so, the American Unitarian Association just existed to promote what they called pure Christianity. Pure Christianity was understood as Christianity that was untainted by the dogma of the Trinity. Remember, these were Unitarians. They denied the Trinity. And also untainted by the infallibility of Scripture and of salvation through the atoning sacrifice of the God-man, Jesus. So all of those things were not in the Unitarian realm of belief. So they believed that they had a pure version of Christianity that didn't have any of those problematic structures. These first 100 years included a lot of theological struggle for the Unitarians. And so you can imagine that the Transcendentalists, for example, had a very destabilizing influence on our Unitarian ancestors. This was including, of course, the famous Unitarian minister Ralph Waldo Emerson, who gave a sermon at the Harvard Divinity School that was called An Appalling Heresy. And so the struggle continued between those who wanted the Unitarian Association to remain a Christian denomination and those who wanted to go, quote unquote, beyond Christianity to naturalistic and ethically based religions. So in 1894, after years of debate and division, the National Conference of Unitarian Congregations adopted a new statement, which read, "These churches accept the religion of Jesus, holding in accordance with his teachings that practical religion is summed up in this: love to God and love to man. Love your God and love your neighbor with all your heart." It continued, clarifying that this was not to be used as a creedal test for admission, but that all were welcome who were in general sympathy with our spirit and our practical aims. Now, in the early 20th century, the non-theistic humanist ministers serving Unitarian churches got more vocal. They started a long humanist-theist debate within Unitarianism. And during World War II, when Unitarianism had suffered a serious loss of membership, revered minister A. Powell Davies was charged with writing a statement that would set the theological ground for the growth of our movement. And the result was a statement of 5 principles: individual freedom of belief, discipleship to advancing truth, the democratic process in human relations, universal brotherhood, undivided by nation, race, or creed, and allegiance to the cause of a united world community. Now you can hear a lot of language in there that sounds pretty familiar, right? But there were only 5 principles at that time. And that was what the Unitarians brought to the merger between the Unitarians and the Universalists, the 5 principles that they were working with. Now, at that time, that was when the original 7 principles got created. They were very similar to the current version, but they did not have the idea of the interdependent web of life. At General Assemblies in the 1980s, then, the principles got rearranged and the interdependent web was added. So you can see there were some shifting, some things got merged because they all have to do with one another, right? They are not separate categories. They are one living set of principles. Now, they've been revised over the years, including a very dramatic moment with the sources, when the binary statement about words and deeds of prophetic men and women in our 6 sources was changed to the words and deeds of prophetic people to eliminate the gender binary. And that happened just a few years ago at a General Assembly. And so if you look in your gray hymnal, because the hymnals were published before that change happened, you will still see the old language about men and women, but that has actually been changed. So you see that this is a living tradition and a living set of statements that we have the power to add to. We've heard changes in language. We've heard things being taken away or consolidated together. Now, elsewhere in the bylaws, there's a provision that Article 2 be reviewed at least every 15 years, with a 2-year process of study and discussion and information gathering from UUs of all kinds. And then what happens is that any proposed amendments go to 2 consecutive General Assemblies for further consideration and amendments, and finally voting to approve. So this is a long, long process, and it involves many, many voices and many, many years of study and information dissemination and opportunities for UUs to weigh in, for our voices to be heard at the gathering of our Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. Now, what's happening now is, let me give you a little background, that at our General Assembly in 2019 in Spokane, Washington, the Board of Trustees for the UUA formally charged a group of people to begin a review of Article 2. Article 2, again, is the place where the principles, the sources, and the covenant live. Now, this group was made up of 2 youth and 4 adults, all with diverse backgrounds and identities, and they've been working since 2019 to fulfill that charge. And they will release their first draft of the new Article 2 recommendations either in February or March. So after 70 plus years of something very like the 7 principles and the 6 sources, we are getting ready to reevaluate who we are and what's our foundation. So one thing that we are pretty sure is going to happen is that the proposal will be more expansive than it has been in the last few review periods, and that the commission has been encouraged to be creative in its approach, and it's also been charged with being explicitly anti-racist in its orientation. So once we receive it, once we receive these recommendations, it's our job as a member congregation to review it and discuss it and to consider if we want our delegates to support the draft as it is, or if we would support an amendment when it goes to General Assembly in June. And that General Assembly is taking place in Portland this year, and that is a time each summer when delegates from all over the country, from the member congregations, get together to do the business of our National Association of Congregations. And so the proposed new version of Article 2 may be going to a vote in June of 2023. Now, I don't know if you have been to a General Assembly or have experienced it, but it's a very exciting time when Unitarian Universalists get together to learn and study and be together in community and worship together, and also do, as I said, the business of our association. They attempt to make real our covenant of care for one another, and they wrestle with theology and practice and identity and difference, with all of their strengths and shortcomings as imperfect people who see things differently. They will be asking, who are we? And who's included in that we? Who do we want to become? Are we really living our values? If yes, let's celebrate that. If not, let's figure out how to articulate and then live into it better. So when the new draft is released, we will be offering opportunities in this congregation for conversation and study, and we will engage with this process of collective discernment about the way forward. Now, just to say a little bit more about the 7 principles, one of the things I would like to say is that it's been very unexpected that the 7 principles has been so enthusiastically adopted by the congregations over the years. When the folks were writing it, they really thought that it was going to be one of these dry statements of principles and purposes that live in some charter somewhere. But when people got a hold of it, they got really excited about it. And so you saw all the different, the trees and the rainbows and the ceiling paintings and all the things. And I think part of the reason that that is such a, it's something that really speaks to us in the congregations is that it gives us a series of statements about what we really hold dear. And without a sacred text, without a Bible or a Quran or a sacred text that we can grab a hold of and find these things to hold on to as eternal truths, sometimes we end up thinking of the 7 principles as eternal truths. And so we have to remember that these principles were created about 70 years ago from other documents that changed over the years. And so I just want to say a couple things about the 7 principles. You could think of them as Reverend Kristina's principles about the principles, if you want to. First of all, as we've seen, they're not set in stone and they're not written on stone tablets. So there is room for change here. As Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams said, revelation is not sealed. We are still learning about our world. We're still learning about how best to live in our world together. And so it is best for us to stay open to those revelations and to think of the principles as a sort of living document. Second, the principles point to truths, but they are not a perfect statement of those truths. Truths can be expressed in many ways, as we've seen today. As we've seen, the principles don't change, the principles that the words are pointing to, but the ways that we express them can change and adapt as our language and our way of living and our way of being together changes and adapts. 3, the principles are interdependent. They are not separate categories. And that is why I love the tree image of the branches of the principles, or branches intertwining on a vine. Maybe you could picture a creature with 7 arms, and each arm is a principle. I don't know. The point is that there is a wholeness. There is a wholeness to the principles that belies the idea that they are each in a separate category, unrelated to one another. For example, justice, equity, and compassion cannot be separated from the idea of a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Respect for an individual's inherent worth and dignity is a pillar of the democratic process where each person has a voice in what happens. And also, that same inherent worth and dignity drives the third principle, acceptance of one another in all of our uniqueness. So they are all interrelated, interdependent, intertwining parts of a whole. Fourth principle about the principles. They are meant to be created and amended and discussed and debated and articulated and re-articulated by groups of UUs joining together as an association. They are not received wisdom. And indeed, we would never have accepted them, I believe, if they were received wisdom, but they are crafted community wisdom. As such, they can change over time, as we've already noted. And finally, the fifth of Reverend Kristina's principles about the principles, an active orientation to these words is best. We can ask ourselves, how do we incorporate these principles into congregational life? How do we live them into our congregational budget, into relationships with staff and other congregants and other congregations? How do we live these principles in our daily lives? Are we living them? Here is another articulation, yet another articulation of the principles that invites and prescribes decisive action. Number one, we believe in the inherent worthiness of every person. 2, we show compassion and fairness toward all people. 3, we accept others for who and what they are. 4, we grow through a supported search for personal truth. 5, we apply the democratic process in our congregations and our communities. 6, we work for global community. We work for global community founded on peace, liberty, and justice. And 7, we respect the interwoven nature of the universe. The interwoven nature of our principles reflects the interwoven quality of the universe that we just described. As we move into this unknown future together, I invite each of us and all of us to open our hearts and our minds to a new articulation of our Unitarian Universalist principles, and to discover how we, Unitarian Universalists, continue to recover and uncover and rediscover community wisdom for living through this important testament of who we are as a people, the living, changing, growing, and breathing Unitarian Universalist principles. May it be so.